The book of Ezra is a historical account in the Old Testament that chronicles the return of the Jewish people from exile in Babylon and the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Set in the 5th century BC, the book highlights the fulfillment of God's promise to restore his people after their captivity. Ezra, a priest and scribe, plays a central role in leading the second wave of exiles back to Jerusalem and reinstituting the law of Moses among the people. The book emphasizes themes of restoration, covenant faithfulness, and spiritual renewal, showing how God works through political leaders like Cyrus of Persia and religious figures like Ezra to reestablish his people in their homeland. It also underscores the importance of obedience to God's commands and the need for spiritual and communal reform. Now, here's a narrative retelling of the book of Ezra, the decree of Cyrus. The book of Ezra begins in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Cyrus had just conquered Babylon, bringing the Israelites under Persian rule. While they had been living in exile for decades, God moved the heart of King Cyrus to allow the Israelites to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The king issued a decree saying, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem and build the temple of the Lord." This was an incredible moment for the Jewish exiles. For nearly 70 years, they had been living in a foreign land after the Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Now, through the decree of a foreign king, their exile was ending, and they could return home. Not only that, but Cyrus also returned the valuable gold and silver items that had been taken from the temple by the Babylonians. He encouraged the people of Persia to support the returning exiles with gifts of gold, silver, and other provisions for the journey and the rebuilding of the temple. The first wave of returnees, led by Sheshbazzar, the governor of Judah, and Jeshua the priest, nearly 50,000 Jews returned from exile to Jerusalem. They were of various families, including priests, Levites, and temple servants. Along with their belongings and animals, they brought the articles of the temple that Cyrus had returned to them. When they arrived in Jerusalem, the sight of the ruined city and the destroyed temple must have been overwhelming. But despite the devastation, the first task the people undertook was rebuilding the altar of God. They needed to restore worship and sacrifice to the Lord, following the law of Moses. Jeshua and Zerubbabel, another leader in the group, led the people in rebuilding the altar and offering burnt offerings to God. This was a powerful act of faith, as they began to reestablish their connection with the Lord in the land he had promised to their ancestors. Once the altar was built, the people celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles and offered regular sacrifices. Worship was once again alive in Jerusalem. But the task ahead was still immense, rebuilding the temple itself. So, the people collected donations and began to gather materials and workers for the temple construction. They even received help from people in Tyre and Sidon, who provided timber from the famous cedars of Lebanon, laying the foundation of the temple. The second year after their return, the work on the temple finally began. Jeshua, Zerubbabel, and the other leaders appointed Levites to oversee the construction. When the foundation of the temple was laid, there was great celebration. The priests and Levites led the people in songs of praise to the Lord, thanking him for his goodness and faithfulness. The people shouted with joy because they could see the beginning of the restoration of the temple. However, not everyone was celebrating. Some of the older priests and Levites who had seen the original temple wept aloud. To them, this new foundation seemed smaller and less grand than the Temple of Solomon, which had been destroyed. The mixture of joy and sorrow blended together, and the sounds of weeping and rejoicing filled the air. Opposition to the rebuilding. As the rebuilding of the temple progressed, opposition arose. The neighboring peoples who had settled in the region during the exile, including the Samaritans, offered to help with the construction. But Zerubbabel and Jeshua refused their offer, saying, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord." These neighbors were not true followers of the God of Israel, and the Jewish leaders wanted to keep the project purely dedicated to their God. Angered by the refusal, these neighbors became adversaries. They began to actively work against the rebuilding efforts, trying to discourage the people of Judah and frighten them. They hired officials to frustrate the plans and slow down the progress of construction. Their opposition didn't stop there. The enemies of Judah wrote letters to the new king of Persia, Artaxerxes, accusing the Jews of rebellion. They warned that if Jerusalem and its temple were rebuilt, the Jews would no longer pay taxes or be loyal to the king. As a result, King Artaxerxes issued an order to halt the construction of the temple. The work came to a standstill for several years. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah. Though the work on the temple had been stopped, God did not abandon his people or his plan. He sent prophets Haggai and Zechariah to encourage the people and call them back to the task of rebuilding. Haggai rebuked the people for focusing on building their own houses, while the temple of God lay in ruins. He urged them to consider their ways and to renew their commitment to the Lord's house. Zechariah, on the other hand, brought messages of hope and encouragement. He shared visions of God's future plans for Jerusalem, promising that God's blessing would return to his people if they remained faithful. Inspired by the words of the prophets, Zerubbabel and Jeshua resumed the work on the temple. This time, they faced opposition again, but they were undeterred. The governor of the region, Tattenai, and his officials questioned the Jewish leaders about their authority to rebuild the temple and sent another letter to the Persian king, Darius, asking for confirmation of the decree issued by Cyrus. Shikansit, Darius's decree. King Darius ordered a search of the royal archives to confirm whether Cyrus had indeed issued a decree to rebuild the temple. Sure enough, the decree was found, and it not only confirmed the right of the Jews to rebuild the temple, but Darius also issued a new order that their efforts should not be hindered. He commanded the regional officials to provide the Jews with whatever they needed: supplies, animals for sacrifices, and financial support from the royal treasury. Anyone who opposed this decree would face severe punishment. With this renewed support from the Persian king, the people of Judah pressed forward with the rebuilding of the temple. The work progressed steadily, and after several more years, the temple was finally completed in the 6th year of King Darius's reign. The dedication of the temple. When the temple was completed, there was great rejoicing among the people. The priests, Levites, and all the returnees gathered to dedicate the house of God with a grand celebration. They offered sacrifices, including hundreds of bulls, rams, and lambs, and appointed the priests and Levites to their duties in the temple, according to the law of Moses. Worship was fully restored in Jerusalem, and the people once again celebrated the Passover. For the first time in decades, the Jews in Jerusalem could worship the Lord in the temple, the central place of their faith. It was a powerful moment of renewal and restoration, as the people saw how God had been faithful to bring them back from exile and restore what had been lost. Ezra's arrival and reforms. Years later, during the reign of King Artaxerxes of Persia, a new leader emerged, Ezra, a skilled scribe and teacher of the law of Moses. Ezra had devoted himself to studying the law and teaching it to the people of Israel. The king of Persia not only supported Ezra's mission to teach the Jews, but also provided him with resources to beautify the temple and continue the work of restoring Jerusalem. Ezra arrived in Jerusalem with a second wave of exiles, carrying gold, silver, and temple articles provided by the king. Upon arrival, he discovered a troubling situation. Many of the Jews had intermarried with the pagan peoples of the land, which was forbidden by the law of Moses. This compromise threatened the purity and identity of God's people. Ezra was deeply grieved by this sin. He tore his clothes, fasted, and prayed, confessing the sins of the people before God. His prayer of repentance moved the hearts of the people, and they gathered around him, weeping over their unfaithfulness. Ezra called on the people to separate themselves from their foreign wives and recommit themselves to the covenant with God. Despite the difficulty and emotional pain, the people responded to Ezra's leadership. They agreed to put away their foreign wives and return to the ways of the Lord. This act of repentance marked the final step in the spiritual restoration of the Jewish people after their return from exile. And 8. This narrative of the book of Ezra highlights the themes of restoration, faithfulness, and the perseverance of God's people in the face of opposition. From the decree of Cyrus to the reforms led by Ezra, the story demonstrates how God's promises to his people were fulfilled through the rebuilding of the temple and the renewal of their faith.